write a lot about illegal immigration in this country. Why is it such a controversial issue?
It's a controversial issue, I think, for a lot of reasons that don't always get talked about. The usual explanation, I think, is either that the United States is a nation of laws, and it's somehow taken as obvious that illegal immigrants have come here and broken the law. I think that's true in one sense, but I think there are many other dynamics going on. I think that, and then the second explanation that's often offered, particularly in the media, I think, is that this reaction to illegal immigration in the United States is an example of racism or xenophobia of the sort that we see recurring in American history toward immigrants. And I don't think that explanation is very convincing either. Either the notion that we're simply a nation of laws, or that this is somehow just simply racism and xenophobia. I think the reasons are a little bit deeper than that. On the one hand, the notion of us being a nation of laws, think about it. People who get upset about illegal immigrants focus on the illegal immigrants. They broke the law. That's true. They did break the law. But the people who hired them broke the law too. We don't hear a whole lot about that. And I think that's for some obvious reasons. The illegal immigrants are relatively weak and powerless. There's no denying that. Employers, they're Americans, presumably, although lots of immigrants hire illegal immigrants, but they're Americans. They have some presumed right to be here, and they're well organized. They tend to be politically potent, particularly employers. So they don't get focused on, but illegal immigrants get focused on. Now that sounds like maybe there's some racism floating around in here. People, if all that's true, then maybe that's because they're a racially marginal group. But again, I don't think that really gets us very far. It's the kind of answer my students often come up with, but I don't think, again, it really tells us what's going on. I think what it underlies the surface here is that illegal immigrants really do pose a lot of challenges to the American social and economic system, especially socially and culturally. And it's often difficult for us to face up to that. The basic dynamic that drives illegal immigrants here is really rather similar to what has driven immigrants generally to the United States. Americans don't like to really face up to this, but people don't typically move to the United States. Immigrants haven't typically moved to the United States because they dream of becoming Americans. That's sometimes been true. It's been true when people are refugees, when Jews came here in the 19th century fleeing the pogroms, or when Soviet Jews came here in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They were leaving one country and coming to the United States as a refuge. They knew they weren't going back home. Yet lots of other immigrants in our history, and including illegal immigrants today, come here and came here only planning to stay for a short time, working very hard, saving money, and then planning to go home. That was true of Italians at the end of the 19th century, when 2/3 of the Italians who came here in that period wound up going back to Italy because it was easy to do so on steamship, which was relatively cheap and fast. And today, illegal immigrants who are overwhelmingly from the Latin countries to our south, Mexico and Central America, they don't plan to stay here. They plan to come here, work hard, save money, send it home, buy themselves land, build themselves a house, and go back. That's really hard for Americans to appreciate. They want to think that everyone comes here and just is dying to be an American citizen. It ain't necessarily so. But the second implication of what I've just laid out is that if people come here and don't plan to stay, they cut lots of corners. They take lots of chances. They wind up living in very crowded and substandard conditions. Sometimes that's because they're getting exploited by landlords, and they often get exploited by employers. There's no denying that. But they put up with those kinds of conditions because they know, at least they think they know, that they're not going to stay here. They're more focused on making money and saving money, so they don't want to spend a lot of money on good accommodations or other kinds of consumer items. They want to save it and then go home. That also means that, however, that they create problems for their neighbors. The kinds of complaints one hears about illegal immigrants that I think we should take seriously. Not all of them, not all the complaints are accurate, unfortunately, on the part of people who get upset. But some of them are. When they talk about illegal immigrants, creating crowding conditions, being noisy. Suddenly there are 20 people living next door to you in a house that used to have 4 people. Those kinds of things, I think, are real, and they reflect the fact that immigrants, illegal immigrants in particular, put up with conditions that most Americans won't tolerate because they're not planning on sticking around. And obviously, this isn't how it all plays out in the long term. These illegal immigrants who come here not planning to stay, often, obviously, millions, we have 11 million of them here now, they wind up staying. Things get complicated. Somebody gets pregnant and they wind up having a child here, and that child's a citizen. They don't want to let go of a job. Things don't look so good if they go back home for a trip. And so obviously things change. But even then, we know that people who have been here 20, 25 years from Mexico and Latin American countries, they've raised families here. They will continue to tell their children, someday I'm going to go home, and home is still back in Mexico where they came from. It's also why relatively small numbers of illegal immigrants who have become eligible to become citizens, which is something that happened in 1986 with the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. We know that only 40% of those people who received amnesty, who could have become citizens, have actually become citizens. 60% decided they didn't want to become citizens 25 years after the eligibility began. So I think that tells us a lot. We're dealing with a population that doesn't intend to stay. And even though it winds up staying, there's a kind of hesitation or a lack of commitment to putting down roots. And that has ramifications in terms of their children, how they get raised, whether they stay in schools or not, or move around a lot. And I think that kind of instability, the kinds of disruptions in terms of neighborhoods that I was talking about before, in terms of illegal immigrants settling into neighborhoods in crowded conditions and so forth, I think that explains, in part, the kinds of negative reactions that non-immigrant Americans have to illegal immigrants. So I think that kind of disruption poses the kind of challenge that lots of Americans feel. Not all Americans. And maybe that's something that would be worth my talking about for a moment, about the kinds of Americans who respond differently and why different Americans respond so differently. And that's a very important political question in the current debate, because clearly we have a substantial segment of the American people who are very well disposed toward immigrants, whether they're legal or illegal. Particularly, they respond to the plight of 11 million illegal immigrants who are here. And I appreciate the fact that those 11 million illegal immigrants are in a difficult situation. So I understand why many of our elites in particular, in the media, certainly most of the people in the academy and universities tend to respond very positively to the plight of illegal immigrants. And then, of course, on the other side of the political divide, we have the Tea Party movement and more, shall we say, ordinary Americans who aren't so well educated, who aren't so well off. They tend to respond much more negatively. And I think that just the way I've described that response suggests or points to what's going on. I think this is in many ways a reflection of social class differences. I think if you're well educated, and this is well borne out by survey data, if you're well educated and well off, you tend to look upon immigrants generally, low-skilled immigrants in particular, including illegal immigrants, and they tend to be low-skilled for sure. Not all of them, but they certainly tend to be. You're inclined to regard immigrants as people who can help you, people whose services you can buy and from which you'll benefit, whether it's gardeners, house painters, nannies, waiters in restaurants. That's quite understandable. But the fact is, and this gets overlooked, I think, very often by our political and media elites, is that lots of Americans do those things for themselves. They can't afford to buy those services. And they're, from the get-go, aren't too inclined to see low-skilled immigrants, especially illegal immigrants who pose the kinds of challenges I was talking about before in terms of disrupting neighborhoods and so forth. They're not inclined to see these people as a boon. They're likely to see them as burdens. Lots of the kinds of Americans I'm talking about often claim and charge that illegal immigrants compete with them in the labor market. I don't think that is borne out by the evidence. But they do pose challenges and threats to ordinary Americans who don't see themselves as buying their services. And the fact of the matter is, given the way our fiscal structure is, the kinds of burdens that illegal immigrants pose in terms of public services, hospitals, their children go to public schools, those kinds of services get paid for at the local and state level, and they're not insubstantial, particularly in a state like California or Texas to a less extent. And I think that also fuels this reaction on the part of less affluent Americans, that there is a tax burden and a fiscal burden that's quite real. So I think that dimension of who benefits, who sees themselves benefiting, and who doesn't benefit from illegal immigration is important. But I don't think it gets much attention in the public debate, partly because of what I said earlier, that it's hard for Americans to understand why immigrants generally and why illegal immigrants have come here, what drives it. We have this mythology. Immigration speaks to our notion of ourselves as a country, and we see ourselves as a nation of immigrants. But as I've suggested, it's more complicated than that.
What are the most important political and legal challenges posed by illegal immigration?
I'll focus on the political first of all, and I think one of the basic challenges here about trying to address the presence of 11 million illegal immigrants among us is what it is that they want. Again, that's not something that gets talked about a lot. It's always presumed that they want to become citizens. And that is obviously a political challenge that we're in the middle of right now, because clearly there's a substantial segment of the American populace who aren't prepared to tolerate that notion that these people who came here illegally will become citizens. And then on the other side of the divide, of course, there's a strong push from the many Hispanic leaders, because many of these people are Hispanic, and from their liberal and democratic supporters that these illegal immigrants should be provided a pathway to citizenship. From my perspective, what's challenging here politically is that, as I alluded to earlier, a large number of illegal immigrants, based on our historical experience in the last 20, 30 years, don't necessarily want to become citizens. I think a reasonable reading of the evidence is that the 11 million that we have, because illegal immigrants don't typically come here planning to stay, and because of the evidence that the ones who have had the option of becoming citizens in the past have, by a majority, a good majority, have decided not to become citizens, I think it's arguable that that a big proportion of these 11 million don't want to either. So, but that doesn't get articulated or voiced in the public debate, because obviously we're dealing with a population that's, shall we say, politically inert. It doesn't vote. It's not organized. It's not prepared to voice much, except for some young people who are, pushing for the DREAM Act. Some young illegal immigrants that's not typical of all illegal immigrants, that group of young people. So that we're dealing with this kind of conundrum of trying to address what we assume are their needs, or respond to the demands of a group that's here illegally, but that group, because it's not here legally, isn't organized to be part of the political system. It winds up being a kind of vacuum into which other views get drawn, the views of liberals who want to defend illegal immigrants, or the views of conservatives who want to punish them. Part of that debate isn't what illegal immigrants themselves are saying. So, and clearly it's the liberal democratic view who want to provide a path to citizenship. Not all liberals and not all Democrats, a few Republicans, but not too many these days. They're prepared to provide this road to citizenship, but it seems to me it isn't so clear that that's what illegal immigrants themselves want. It seems to me they're probably willing to settle for a whole lot less. And that's one reason, for example, you haven't asked me this yet, but maybe we can talk about my proposal of providing a substantial proportion of the 11 million illegal immigrants who are here, not a path to citizenship, but a very straightforward and easy path to permanent non-citizen status. And that's what I proposed. It hasn't gotten much traction in the current debate, although I'm clinging to the notion that perhaps it might be a way to resolve the current Donnybrook over this issue. It seems to me that on the one hand, for many of the reasons we've talked about, there is a deep and undeniable anxiety and to some extent even anger among a segment of the American populace against illegal immigrants. As I've tried to suggest, I think some of the reasons for that anger and that disaffection with illegal immigrants is rational and legitimate. It often gets expressed in ways that are not very pleasant and often sometimes put in very irrational rhetoric. But I think at its base, there's reason to understand why people are anxious about illegal immigrants. On the other hand, illegal immigrants are here. They're not going anywhere. Mitt Romney learned that lesson, I think, that no one's going to self-deport. We're not going to, and we're not going to deport 11 million illegal immigrants. And the fact is, if they're here illegally, it's because they were hired illegally, as I mentioned before, by some American. So we have a certain responsibility to make this right. So we've got, on the one hand, a responsibility to make this situation right. On the other hand, a fairly substantial and certainly very vocal segment of the American populace who are resistant to giving anything to illegal immigrants. So what do we do? Well, my proposal is an effort to try to cut the difference and to say, yes, these people who are here illegally should not be granted a path to normality. There should be some serious penalty attaching to what they did. On the other hand, they are here because, in some basic sense, we Americans wanted them to be here. We have to own up to that. We have to resolve this problem. And so I think one way of doing that would be to allow as many of the 11 million as possible with as few restrictions as possible, barring those who have criminal records or something along those lines. From if we bar those, but allow the vast majority of the rest of the 11 million to proceed to normality, that is to say, the status of non-citizen permanent resident that I've proposed, I think that would be a way of resolving this fundamental disagreement. And, by the way, as I've said a couple of times now, I think it would be what the large majority of illegal immigrants would be more than content to settle for, because that kind of status would allow them to work. It would allow them to participate, presumably, it would depend on how it gets structured in Congress, but to participate presumably in Social Security. It would allow them to come back and forth across the border, and that's an important aspect for a lot of illegal immigrants, because they do want to go home, but they are inclined to come back. So that would be my proposal. And as I said, so far it hasn't gotten much traction in Washington, but I'm not sure the game is over yet.
What distinction would you draw as a scholar of immigration policy between legal and illegal immigration?
Yeah, I think that's a really good and important question, because obviously on the surface, and you know, there's the simple fact that if you're a legal immigrant, you come here legitimately, you come here through normal channels, and if you're an illegal immigrant, you've come here surreptitiously and you've violated the law. That's the surface perspective, which is obviously important and which drives the current debate. But the fact is, I'm not convinced that distinction is as clear-cut as we like to think it is. It's certainly become the basis of the current political debate. There's no doubt about that. And I'm not proposing that we try to overturn the terms of the debate right now. And that's consistent with my proposal that I talked about earlier about trying to provide a path to permanent status to illegal immigrants. But I think it's useful for us to stop and ponder, nevertheless, what these two categories, legal and illegal, really tell us about immigration to the United States and how we think about immigration, we Americans. And basically, my perspective is that the distinction really means a whole lot less than we realize. If you stop and think about what people who are upset about immigration generally say, or people who are upset about illegal immigration, how they express their views. They'll say about illegal immigrants. They'll say, well, they're here illegally. Okay, that's a given. Then they'll say they don't speak English. Then they'll say they make noisy neighbors. Then they'll say they're overcrowding the schools. Then they'll say they're burdening our hospitals. And the list kind of goes on like that. Well, each one of those items we could pull apart and say is accurate or inaccurate. Some of them are true, some of them aren't true. But what strikes me is that that litany of complaints against illegal immigrants is by and large the same litany that gets put forward by people who are upset about immigration generally, and it's the same list that gets put forward about immigrants generally, especially if we're talking about low-skilled legal immigrants. All those same charges get lodged, except, of course, if you come here as a low-skilled worker legally, you're not here illegally, so no one can say you're here illegally. So that tells me that there's something more fundamental, if you will, going on about this reaction to illegal immigrants. It's that this distinction is really a kind of political distinction, not just a legal distinction. The legal distinction is real. The political distinction is real at this point, but it's one that we've created. It's one that in our political discourse we've sort of agreed to agree upon. There was a time 15, 20 years ago when advocates in behalf of high levels of immigration were not very eager to draw a line between legal and illegal immigration. They were prepared to defend both of those. Then in the 1990s, when the reaction to illegal immigration really began to set in, Proposition 187 in California in 1994 passed overwhelmingly. That was to deprive illegal immigrants of public services in the state of California. That passed overwhelmingly. It was struck down by the courts later, but that's another story. But that put illegal immigration on the political map, if you will. And at that point, immigration advocates began to back off and draw a line, and allowed to be drawn a line between legal immigrants and illegal immigrants. What I'm suggesting is that became a kind of path of least resistance. It became a way for all of us, not just immigration advocates, to put our hands on a very difficult issue. Immigration obviously poses lots of challenges, both legal and illegal immigration, as to a country like the United States, even though we have a history of immigration. But it pulls us in so many directions, and it poses so many different challenges that it's historically very hard for us to get our hands around. And it pulls us in so many directions politically. So what I'm suggesting is that at some point in the recent past, sometime around the 1990s, I think, we came upon this line that we've drawn, that all the bad things associated with immigration, well, that's got to do with illegal immigrants. And all the good things, that's legal immigrants. And what I'm suggesting is that that's not so clear, because the kinds of burdens and challenges posed by low-income, low-skilled immigrants, if that's what we're talking about. That's not all that we're talking about in the current debate, I realize, but that's a lot of what drives the public reaction to immigration. That whether if you come here with not much education and not many skills, and whether you're legal or illegal, you pose real challenges to our schools, to our hospitals. You may be a boon to our employers. That's clearly the case. But when you lose a job or when you start building and creating a family, then we're talking about these kinds of challenges and the strains on public services. And what I'm suggesting is that we devised this categorization whereby the illegal immigrants get tasked with the negative part, and the legal immigrants are assigned the positive role. And I just don't think it bears close scrutiny. Yet in our political system today, that's kind of the template that we're stuck with.